Welcome to Sleep History, where the most notorious rise and fall stories come alive to guide you into peaceful rest. Tonight's journey takes us into the shadow world of 1920s America, where one man built a criminal empire so vast that it made him more powerful than politicians, judges, and police chiefs combined. This extended sleep story chronicles the incredible life of Al Capone. From his humble beginnings as Alphonse Capone in Brooklyn's immigrant neighborhoods, to his reign as Chicago's undisputed crime king. Discover how Prohibition created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history, and how one man with ruthless ambition and brutal methods seized that opportunity to become the most feared name in the nation. Close your eyes. Let the gentle jazz sounds of a 1920s speakeasy transport you to the streets of Chicago and drift into dreams of Tommy guns, bootleg whiskey, and the man who proved that in America, enough money and violence could buy anything, including justice itself. Sweet dreams await in the shadow of America's greatest criminal empire. What happens when one man becomes so powerful that the entire legal system bends to his will? For nearly a decade, Al Capone operated above the law, untouchable by police, prosecutors, and even federal agents. He ordered murders like most people order coffee, bribed officials like they were employees, and lived in luxury while his enemies disappeared into Chicago River. But even the mightiest criminals eventually discover that no one is truly untouchable. The story begins not in the glittering speakeasies of Chicago, but in the crowded tenements of Brooklyn, where dreams went to die in the shadow of poverty and discrimination. On January 17, 1899, in a cramped apartment on Navy Street, Teresa and Gabriella Capone welcomed their fourth child into a world that promised little more than backbreaking labor and social invisibility. They named him Alphonse, after St. Alphonsus, hoping perhaps that divine protection might shield their son from the harsh realities that awaited Italian immigrants in turn-of-the-century America. The Brooklyn of Al Capone's childhood was a brutal finishing school for the American dream's failures. The Capone family had arrived from the poverty-stricken village of Castellammare di Stabia near Naples, carrying nothing but hope and willingness to work. Like hundreds of thousands of other Italian immigrants, they discovered that America's promise of opportunity came with an asterisk. It was available to those who looked, spoke, and worshipped like the established Protestant majority, while others were relegated to society's margins. Gabriele Capone found work as a barber, a respectable trade that provided just enough income to keep his growing family fed and housed, but never enough to escape the overcrowded immigrant ghetto where violence, vice, and desperation were daily realities. The neighborhood was controlled by established Irish and Jewish gangs, who viewed the newer Italian arrivals as competitors for scarce resources and opportunities. Young Alphonse learned early that in his world, survival often depended more on fists than books, more on street smarts than school learning. The public school system that was supposed to provide immigrant children with pathways to American success instead reinforced their second-class status. At PS7, young Al encountered teachers who viewed Italian children as inherently inferior, guidance counselors who steered them away from academic subjects toward manual trades, and classmates who made daily sport of mocking their accents, their poverty, and their strange foreign customs. The message was clear. America had a place for people like the Capones, but it wasn't at the top. Al's academic career effectively ended in the 6th grade, when a confrontation with a teacher who had publicly humiliated him escalated into violence. The 14-year-old boy struck his teacher and was immediately expelled. But more importantly, he had learned a crucial lesson that would shape his entire life. When people in authority positions abuse their power, sometimes the only response that commands respect is superior force. It was a lesson that would serve him well in his chosen profession. Cast out of the formal education system, Al joined the vast army of working children who helped support their families through whatever employment they could find. He worked in a candy store, a 10-pin bowling alley, and eventually as a paper cutter in a bookbindery. Monotonous, low-paying jobs that provided glimpses of legitimate success while offering no realistic pathway to achieve it. For an ambitious, intelligent young man who observed the wealth and power that surrounded him in America's greatest city, these jobs represented not opportunity, but imprisonment. The real education that would determine Al's future took place in the streets, pool halls, and social clubs of Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods. Here, he encountered older men who had found alternative routes to American success. Men who wore expensive clothes, commanded respect from neighbors, and never seemed to lack for money, despite having no visible, legitimate employment. These were the neighborhood's wise guys, members of the emerging organized crime families that provided immigrants with the protection, opportunity, and respect that American society otherwise denied them. The transformation from Alphonse Capone to Al Capone began during his teenage years when he fell under the influence of Johnny Torrio, a small, quiet man whose unassuming appearance concealed one of the most sophisticated criminal minds of his generation. Torrio operated a network of gambling parlors, brothels, and protection rackets that served the Italian community's needs, while generating substantial profits for those clever enough to organize such activities systematically. More importantly, Torrio understood that criminal enterprises could be run like legitimate businesses, with careful planning, disciplined management, and strategic thinking replacing the impulsive violence that characterized most street crime. Under Torrio's mentorship, young Al learned the fundamental principles that would guide his later empire building. Crime was not just a matter of taking what you wanted through force, but of providing services that people actually needed and were willing to pay for. Protection from rival gangs, gambling opportunities in neighborhoods where such entertainment was otherwise unavailable, prostitution for men whose wives and social circumstances left them sexually frustrated. These were not simply criminal activities, but business enterprises that served real market demands. More crucially, Al learned that sustainable criminal success required political protection. The police, prosecutors, judges, and politicians who officially opposed organized crime could often be convinced to look the other way in exchange for appropriate compensation. Torrio taught him to think of bribes not as criminal expenses, but as business investments that ensured long-term profitability by reducing the risks of prosecution and incarceration. Al's formal initiation into the criminal underworld came when he joined the 5 Points Gang, one of Manhattan's most notorious criminal organizations. The 5 Points was less a structured organization than a loose confederation of thieves, enforcers, and hustlers who controlled criminal activities in lower Manhattan's most dangerous neighborhoods. Here, Al learned to use violence professionally, not as an expression of anger or frustration, but as a business tool that could solve problems, eliminate competition, and maintain the respect that was essential for criminal authority. It was during his time with the 5 Points Gang that Alphonse Capone acquired both his famous scars and his shortened name. Working as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island dance hall and saloon, he made the mistake of insulting the sister of a small-time hoodlum named Frank Galluccio. The resulting fight left Al with 3 deep knife scars across the left side of his face, wounds that would mark him for life and earn him the nickname Scarface, though no one ever dared use it to his face after he gained power. The scars were more than just physical disfigurement. They were a badge of authenticity in a world where reputation meant everything. Men who had been marked by violence and survived commanded more respect than those who had avoided confrontation. Al learned to wear his scars proudly, understanding that they communicated his willingness to fight and his ability to survive conflicts that destroyed lesser men. By 1919, Al had established himself as a capable and reliable member of New York's criminal underworld, but he remained essentially a hired hand in other men's organizations. He had money, respect within his narrow community, and the skills necessary to prosper in his chosen profession, but he lacked the opportunity to build something truly his own. That opportunity would come from an unexpected source: the United States government's decision to ban the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the nation. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which took effect on January the 16th, 1920, was intended to solve America's alcohol problem by making drinking illegal. Instead, it created the greatest criminal opportunity in the nation's history by transforming a legal, regulated industry worth billions of dollars into an underground market that could only be served by those willing to operate outside the law. For men like Al Capone, who had already chosen criminal careers, Prohibition represented not a moral challenge, but a business opportunity of unprecedented scope. Johnny Torrio, who had moved to Chicago to manage criminal operations for his uncle Big Jim Colosimo, recognized immediately that Prohibition would revolutionize organized crime in America. The small-scale gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets that had previously sustained criminal enterprises would be dwarfed by the enormous profits available to those who could organize large-scale alcohol smuggling and distribution networks. But such operations would require more sophisticated management, greater capital investment, and higher levels of violence than traditional criminal activities. Torrio needed talented associates who combined criminal experience with business acumen and the willingness to use whatever force necessary to protect their investments. In late 1919, Torrio sent for Al Capone, offering him a position in the Chicago organization that would transform both men's lives. For Al, it represented the chance to leave behind his status as a small-time New York operator and become part of something much larger and more profitable. He had no way of knowing that he was about to enter a city where his particular combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma would make him the most powerful criminal in American history. The young man who boarded the train for Chicago in 1919 was no longer the expelled schoolboy or struggling legitimate worker who had grown up in Brooklyn's tenements. At 20 years old, Al Capone had transformed himself into a professional criminal with the skills, connections, and mindset necessary to prosper in America's underground economy. He understood violence, corruption, and the market dynamics that drove illegal enterprises. Most importantly, he had learned to think of himself not as a victim of American society's discrimination and limited opportunities, but as an entrepreneur who had found alternative routes to the success that legitimate paths had denied him. Chicago was waiting, and with it the opportunity to build an empire that would make Al Capone's name synonymous with American crime for generations to come. Chicago in 1920 was a city perfectly designed for the career of Al Capone. America's railroad hub, industrial powerhouse, and playground for the newly rich. It combined vast, legitimate wealth with a political system so thoroughly corrupted that crime and government had become virtually indistinguishable. Into this urban laboratory of American capitalism and corruption stepped the young man from Brooklyn, carrying nothing but ambition and the lessons learned in New York's meanest streets. The Chicago that greeted Al Capone was simultaneously the most American and least American of cities. Built from nothing in less than a century, it embodied the nation's faith in progress, technology, and the transformative power of pure ambition. The Great Fire of 1871 had destroyed most of the city, but Chicagoans had rebuilt it bigger, taller, and more magnificent than before. Skyscrapers pierced the prairie sky, while steel mills and stockyards processed the raw materials of a continent into the wealth that built America's industrial economy. But Chicago's rapid growth had also created opportunities for those who preferred to make their fortunes outside the law. The city's political machine, perfected by men like Hinky Dink Kenner and Bathhouse John Coughlin, had turned corruption into a science that made honest government virtually impossible. Police protection, judicial favors, and political influence were all available for purchase, while the complicated web of local, state, and federal jurisdictions created numerous opportunities for those clever enough to exploit bureaucratic confusion and competing authorities. Into this environment stepped Johnny Torrio, Al Capone's mentor, and the man who would transform Chicago's criminal underworld from a collection of competing street gangs into a sophisticated business enterprise. Torrio had been summoned to Chicago by his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled much of the city's South Side vice trade through a network of brothels, gambling houses, and protection rackets. But Colosimo, despite his success in traditional criminal enterprises, failed to recognize the revolutionary opportunity that Prohibition represented. The old criminal economy had been limited by the relatively small market for illegal services like gambling and prostitution. Most Americans might occasionally place a bet or visit a brothel, but these were niche markets that could support only modest criminal enterprises. Alcohol, however, was consumed by virtually every adult American, creating a market worth billions of dollars that had suddenly been placed off limits to legitimate business. Whoever could organize large-scale alcohol production, smuggling, and distribution would have access to profits that dwarfed anything previously available to American criminals. Torrio understood this immediately, but Colosimo was too set in his ways to embrace the new opportunity. When the old boss refused to expand into bootlegging, Torrio made the decision that would define his and Al Capone's careers. He had Colosimo murdered. On May 11th, 20, Big Jim was shot dead in the lobby of his own restaurant, clearing the way for a new generation of criminals who understood that Prohibition had changed everything. Al Capone's role in the Colosimo assassination remains unclear, but his rapid rise in Torrio's organization afterward suggests that he had proven his reliability during this crucial transition. By 1921, he was serving as Torrio's chief lieutenant, managing day-to-day operations while his boss focused on strategic planning and political relationships. The partnership was perfect. Torrio provided the brains and connections, while Capone supplied the charisma and willingness to use violence that were essential for maintaining authority in the criminal underworld. The bootlegging operation that Torrio and Capone built in Chicago was unlike anything American crime had seen before. Instead of the small-scale, family-based enterprises that had characterized traditional organized crime, they created a vertically integrated business that controlled every aspect of alcohol production and distribution. They operated breweries that produced beer, distilleries that manufactured whiskey, and transportation networks that moved their products from production facilities to retail outlets throughout the Chicago area. More importantly, they understood that success in the alcohol business required treating it like any other retail industry. Customers needed convenient access to products, reliable quality, and reasonable prices. The speakeasies, blind pigs, and private clubs that sold illegal alcohol had to offer attractive atmospheres, good service, and the assurance that they would not be shut down by police raids. This required not just criminal skills, but legitimate business acumen, the ability to manage employees, maintain inventory, satisfy customers, and plan for long-term growth. Al Capone proved to be a natural at this kind of criminal entrepreneurship. His Brooklyn street education had taught him to read people and situations quickly, while his experience with violence had given him the credibility necessary to command respect from both subordinates and competitors. But unlike many criminals who relied primarily on intimidation, Capone understood the importance of building genuine loyalty among his employees and customers. He paid his workers well, protected them from arrest when possible, and ensured that their families were cared for if they were killed or imprisoned in service to the organization. He treated speakeasy operators fairly, providing them with quality products at reasonable prices, while offering protection from both police harassment and rival gangs. Most importantly, he cultivated relationships with ordinary Chicagoans by positioning himself as a colorful character who provided services they wanted while challenging hypocritical laws that they resented. The public image that Al Capone created for himself during the early 1920s was masterfully crafted to maximize his political protection while minimizing public opposition to his activities. He presented himself not as a dangerous criminal, but as a successful businessman who happened to work in an industry that misguided politicians had made illegal. He lived openly and luxuriously, wore expensive clothes, drove expensive cars, and frequented expensive restaurants where he was unfailingly polite to waiters, generous with tips, and charming to fellow diners. This public persona served multiple strategic purposes. It made Capone appear more like a celebrity than a criminal, generating the kind of public fascination that made aggressive prosecution politically dangerous for ambitious officials. It also demonstrated his wealth and power to potential allies and enemies, showing that his organization was prosperous enough to support his lavish lifestyle while remaining profitable. Most importantly, it suggested that Capone's criminal activities were essentially harmless, that he was simply providing services that people wanted in a manner that hurt no one except perhaps the federal treasury. The violence that was always present beneath Capone's public charm was carefully controlled and strategically applied. Unlike the random brutality that characterized many criminal organizations, Capone's use of force was disciplined and purposeful. Rivals who refused reasonable offers to cooperate were eliminated, but only after negotiations had failed and their continued opposition threatened the organization's interests. Police officers who could not be bribed were intimidated, but those who proved willing to accept reasonable compensation were treated as valued business partners. This systematic approach to violence made Capone's organization far more effective than traditional gangs that relied primarily on fear and intimidation. By offering alternatives to violence, cooperation, employment, or simply being left alone, Capone was able to reduce the number of enemies his organization faced while building a network of allies and neutral parties who had no interest in supporting law enforcement efforts against him. The early 1920s also saw Al Capone develop the political relationships that would make him virtually untouchable for nearly a decade. Chicago's political machine was perfectly suited to criminal infiltration because it was already based on the principle that government positions should be used to benefit those who paid for them, rather than to serve abstract concepts like justice or public welfare. Ward bosses who sold votes, judges who fixed cases, and police commanders who protected gambling operations were already part of Chicago's political culture. They simply expanded their services to include protection for bootlegging operations. Capone's approach to political corruption was characteristically systematic and generous. Rather than trying to buy individual favors as needed, he established ongoing relationships with key officials that made them dependent on his continued success. Police captains received regular monthly payments that were more substantial than their official salaries, while judges and prosecutors were rewarded for favorable decisions with bonuses that often exceeded their annual legitimate income. More importantly, Capone understood that successful corruption required providing benefits to the entire political system rather than just individual officials. His organization made substantial contributions to political campaigns, supported candidates who promised favorable treatment, and provided employment for the relatives and friends of cooperative officials. By making himself useful to the political machine as a whole, Capone ensured that attacking him would require taking on the entire corrupt system that governed Chicago. The most crucial political relationship that Capone developed during this period was with Mayor William Big Bill Thompson, whose administration provided the criminal organization with protection that approached formal legal immunity. Thompson, a Republican who had built his career by appealing to Chicago's immigrant and working-class populations, understood that Capone's activities enjoyed substantial popular support among voters who resented prohibition and appreciated the jobs and entertainment that bootlegging provided. Under Thompson's protection, Capone's organization expanded rapidly throughout the Chicago area, establishing breweries in suburban communities where local officials could be easily bought or intimidated. The profits were enormous. Beer that cost 50 cents to produce could be sold for $3 at retail, while imported whiskey that cost $5 in Canada could be resold for $25 in Chicago speakeasies. With hundreds of retail outlets throughout the metropolitan area, the organization was generating millions of dollars in annual revenue by the mid-1920s. But success also brought new challenges and enemies. As Capone's organization grew larger and more prosperous, it attracted the attention of rival gangs who wanted their share of the bootlegging profits. The Irish North Side Gang, led by Dion O'Banion, controlled much of Chicago's North Side and resented Italian expansion into what they considered their territory. The resulting conflict would test everything that Al Capone had learned about business, politics, and violence during his apprenticeship in the criminal underworld. The stage was being set for the gang wars that would make Chicago synonymous with organized crime violence and transform Al Capone from a successful criminal entrepreneur into the most feared man in America. The declaration of war came wrapped in flowers. On November the 10th, 1924, Dion O'Banion, leader of Chicago's North Side Gang, stood arranging chrysanthemums in his flower shop when three men entered asking about a funeral arrangement. O'Banion, who operated the shop as a front for his criminal activities, approached the customers with a smile and his hand extended in greeting. The handshake became a trap as one man gripped O'Banion's right hand, while the other two drew pistols and pumped 6 bullets into the Irish gang leader's chest. The assassination of O'Banion marked the beginning of the Chicago Beer Wars, the most sustained and brutal period of organized crime violence in American history. For the next 5 years, the streets of Chicago would run red with blood, as rival gangs fought for control of the enormously profitable bootlegging trade. At the center of this violence stood Al Capone, who would emerge from the carnage as the undisputed king of Chicago crime and the most notorious criminal in the nation. The killing of O'Banion was both a personal and business necessity for the Torrio Capone organization. The Irish gang leader had been systematically violating the territorial agreements that had previously maintained peace between Chicago's criminal organizations, hijacking Capone's beer trucks, muscling in on Italian-controlled speakeasies, and generally treating the South Side operation with contempt. More dangerously, O'Banion had been providing information to federal agents about Italian bootlegging operations while protecting his own activities through separate arrangements with law enforcement officials. But O'Banion's death, rather than solving the territorial problem, instead escalated it into an all-out war that would consume Chicago's criminal underworld for the remainder of the decade. The North Side Gang, now led by the hot-tempered Jaime Weiss and the psychopathic George Babyface Nelson, swore revenge against the Italians and began a campaign of violence designed to drive Capone's organization out of business permanently. The result was a series of assassinations, bombings, and gun battles that turned Chicago into a battlefield where civilian casualties were considered acceptable collateral damage. The first major retaliation came on January the 12th, 1925, when Northside gunmen ambushed Johnny Torrio outside his Southside home, pumping multiple bullets into the man who had built Chicago's first modern criminal empire. Torrio survived the attack, but barely, spending weeks in the hospital before announcing his retirement from active criminal leadership. The decision was practical, as well as personal. Torrio understood that the level of violence now required to maintain control in Chicago exceeded his temperament and abilities. The future belonged to men who could match their enemies' brutality while maintaining the business discipline necessary to run profitable criminal enterprises. Al Capone was ready for such leadership. At 26 years old, he had spent 5 years learning the intricacies of large-scale criminal operations while developing the political relationships and organizational skills necessary to manage complex business enterprises. More importantly, he had demonstrated repeatedly that he possessed the personal courage and capacity for violence that commanded respect in the criminal underworld. When Torrio formally transferred control of the organization to his former lieutenant, Capone, inherited the largest and most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. The empire that Capone now controlled was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The organization operated more than 20 breweries throughout the Chicago area, produced thousands of gallons of beer and whiskey daily, and supplied alcohol to over 10,000 retail outlets, ranging from elegant downtown speakeasies to neighborhood blind pigs. The payroll included hundreds of workers in legitimate brewing and distilling operations, plus additional hundreds of drivers, guards, collectors, and enforcers who handled the criminal aspects of the business. More impressive than the organization's size was its integration with Chicago's legitimate economy and political system. Capone's enterprises provided employment for thousands of Chicagoans during a period when legitimate jobs were often scarce and poorly paid. His speakeasies and gambling houses offered entertainment that was unavailable through legal channels, while his political contributions and bribes ensured that city government remained friendly to business interests rather than moral crusades that would disrupt profitable enterprises. But Capone's inheritance also included the blood feud with the North Side gang that would define much of his career as a criminal leader. Jaime Weiss and his associates were determined to avenge O'Banion's death by destroying the Italian organization entirely, while Capone understood that any sign of weakness or willingness to compromise would encourage other rivals to challenge his authority. The conflict had moved beyond simple business competition into a personal war, where victory required the complete elimination of the opposing organization. The violence that followed was unprecedented in its intensity and public visibility. Previous gang conflicts had been largely confined to the criminal underworld, with casualties primarily limited to professional criminals who had chosen to risk violent death in pursuit of illegal profits. But the Chicago beer wars were fought in broad daylight on public streets, with innocent civilians frequently caught in crossfires between heavily armed criminal organizations that showed no concern for public safety. The most spectacular early battle in this war occurred on September 20th, 1926, when Capone's men launched a coordinated assault on the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, where North Side leaders were meeting to plan additional attacks on Italian operations. The assault involved more than a dozen automobiles filled with gunmen who raked the hotel with machine gun fire for over 20 minutes, turning the building's facade into Swiss cheese, while terrifying hundreds of civilians in the surrounding area. The Hawthorne Hotel attack demonstrated several important characteristics of Capone's approach to criminal warfare. It was carefully planned and executed with military precision, involving multiple vehicles, coordinated timing, and overwhelming firepower that made effective resistance impossible. It was conducted in broad daylight with no attempt at concealment, sending a clear message that Capone's organization was powerful enough to operate openly without fear of police intervention. Most importantly, it was designed to intimidate not just the immediate targets, but the broader criminal community, demonstrating that opposition to Capone would be met with massive retaliation. But the attack also revealed the fundamental problem with the level of violence that the beer wars had reached. The machine gun fire that was intended to eliminate Northside leaders instead killed and wounded numerous innocent civilians who had the misfortune to be in the area when the shooting began. These civilian casualties generated negative publicity that made Capone's activities a matter of public concern rather than simply criminal business that could be ignored by law-abiding citizens. The transformation of Al Capone from a criminal entrepreneur into a public menace was accelerated by his own success in building media relationships that were originally intended to enhance his political protection. Capone understood that favorable press coverage could be as valuable as police corruption in maintaining his freedom of operation, so he cultivated friendships with reporters and editors who presented him as a colorful character rather than a dangerous criminal. The strategy worked brilliantly during the early years of his career, when Capone was portrayed in newspapers as a charming rogue who provided services that people wanted while thumbing his nose at hypocritical politicians. His lavish lifestyle, generous tips, and quotable comments made him a favourite subject for reporters, who found him far more interesting than the dull officials who nominally governed the city. Capone understood the value of this publicity and played his role perfectly, presenting himself as a successful businessman who simply operated in an industry that misguided laws had made illegal. But the beer wars changed public perception of Capone from an amusing character into a serious threat to public safety. The machine gun battles, car bombings, and assassination campaigns that characterized his conflict with rival gangs could not be dismissed as harmless entertainment, while the civilian casualties made it impossible to argue that criminal violence affected only other criminals. Newspapers that had previously portrayed Capone as a lovable rogue began calling him a dangerous menace who needed to be stopped before his activities destroyed the city's reputation and economic prospects. The shift in media coverage reflected broader changes in public attitudes toward organized crime that would ultimately prove fatal to Capone's immunity from prosecution. During the early 1920s, many Americans had viewed bootleggers as folk heroes who were providing valuable services while resisting unpopular government interference in personal behavior. The violence associated with prohibition enforcement was generally blamed on overzealous federal agents rather than the criminals who were simply trying to meet consumer demand for alcoholic beverages. But the Chicago beer wars demonstrated that large-scale criminal organizations inevitably generated levels of violence that threatened public safety and social order. Citizens who had been willing to tolerate bootlegging as a victimless crime began demanding government action when gang battles turned their neighborhoods into war zones. The political protection that had made Capone untouchable became a liability as elected officials found themselves under pressure to demonstrate that they were not controlled by criminal interests. The culmination of this violence came on February the 14th, 1929, with the event that would become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 members of the Northside gang were lined up against a warehouse wall and machine gunned to death by men dressed as police officers in what appeared to be a routine law enforcement raid, but was actually an elaborately planned assassination designed to eliminate Capone's remaining rivals once and for all. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was masterfully planned and executed, demonstrating the sophistication that Capone's organization had achieved in conducting large-scale criminal operations. The killers used stolen police uniforms and vehicles to gain access to their targets, while the warehouse location provided privacy and control that made escape easy after the murders were completed. Most importantly, the attack eliminated the leadership of the North Side gangs so thoroughly that the organization never recovered as an effective rival to Capone's supremacy. But the massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Al Capone's criminal empire. The level of violence required to eliminate his enemies had finally exceeded public tolerance for organized crime, while the brutality of the murders generated national attention that made Capone a symbol of everything that was wrong with American law enforcement. Federal officials who had previously been content to let local authorities handle organized crime recognized that Capone had become too powerful and too notorious to be ignored any longer. The man who had built the greatest criminal empire in American history was about to discover that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations are ultimately vulnerable to determined government prosecution, especially when public opinion demands action and political protection is no longer available. The headlines screamed across the nation on February 15th, 1929, 7 slain in Chicago, gang massacre. Newspapers from New York to Los Angeles carried photographs of the blood-soaked warehouse where Al Capone's men had methodically executed their rivals in what reporters immediately dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But while the nation recoiled in horror at the brutality, Al Capone himself was conveniently vacationing in Florida, establishing the perfect alibi while his organization eliminated the last serious challenge to his criminal supremacy. The Massacre represented both the peak of Capone's power and the beginning of his downfall. By eliminating the Northside Gang's leadership, he had secured his position as the undisputed ruler of Chicago's criminal underworld, commanding an organization that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue while employing thousands of people throughout the metropolitan area. But the public revulsion generated by the murders also marked the end of the popular tolerance that had protected him from serious law enforcement attention. Within weeks of the massacre, Capone found himself labeled public enemy number one by the newly formed Chicago Crime Commission, a business organization that had grown tired of the violence and corruption that were damaging the city's reputation and economic prospects. More ominously, President Herbert Hoover ordered federal agencies to make Capone's prosecution their highest priority, declaring that the Chicago crime boss had become a national embarrassment that required federal intervention to resolve. The federal campaign against Al Capone would demonstrate both the power and limitations of American law enforcement during the Prohibition era. Despite clear evidence that Capone controlled the largest criminal organization in the nation, prosecutors found it surprisingly difficult to build legal cases that would survive court challenges. The same corruption that had protected Capone from local prosecution also influenced federal proceedings. While the sophisticated legal advice that his wealth could purchase created numerous opportunities to delay and obstruct government efforts. More fundamentally, the federal government's approach to prosecuting Capone revealed the contradictions inherent in Prohibition itself. The laws that made alcohol illegal also made it enormously profitable for those willing to break them, while the public demand for alcoholic beverages ensured that criminal organizations would continue to flourish as long as legitimate businesses were prohibited from meeting that demand. Attacking individual criminals like Capone without addressing the underlying policy that created their opportunity was like trying to drain a swamp while leaving the source of water flowing. The first serious federal investigation of Capone's activities began in 1929 under the direction of Treasury agent Eliot Ness, a young, idealistic official who had volunteered to lead a special unit dedicated to disrupting the Chicago organization's operations. Ness understood that traditional law enforcement approaches had failed because they relied on witnesses and informants who could be intimidated or corrupted, so he developed new tactics that emphasized surveillance, intelligence gathering, and attacks on the economic infrastructure that sustained criminal enterprises. Ness's unit, which the media dubbed the Untouchables because of their supposed immunity to corruption, began systematically raiding Capone's breweries, destroying equipment, seizing vehicles, and arresting workers in an effort to disrupt the organization's ability to produce and distribute alcohol. The raids were carefully planned and executed with military precision, often involving coordinated attacks on multiple facilities simultaneously to prevent Capone from shifting operations to avoid interference. But while the Untouchables generated substantial publicity and demonstrated that federal agents could operate effectively despite local corruption, their actual impact on Capone's organization was limited. The raids destroyed equipment and interrupted operations temporarily, but Capone's wealth enabled him to replace losses quickly while relocating production facilities to areas where federal surveillance was less intensive. More importantly, the raids targeted only the operational level of the organization, while leaving the leadership structure and political protection network intact. The more serious threat to Capone's immunity came from an entirely different approach developed by Treasury agent Frank Wilson, who understood that criminal organizations could be vulnerable to prosecution for tax evasion, even when their primary illegal activities were difficult to prove in court. Wilson's investigation focused not on bootlegging operations, but on Capone's failure to pay federal income taxes on his criminal earnings, a charge that required proving only that he had received substantial income and failed to report it to the Internal Revenue Service. The tax evasion approach was brilliant in its simplicity and legal sophistication, unlike bootlegging charges, which required proving specific criminal acts and often depended on witness testimony that could be challenged or corrupted. Tax evasion could be demonstrated through financial records and circumstantial evidence that was much more difficult for defense attorneys to dispute. Moreover, tax evasion was a federal crime that could be prosecuted in federal courts, where local corruption had less influence than in state and local jurisdictions. Wilson's investigation revealed the enormous scope of Capone's criminal empire and the lifestyle it supported. Bank records showed cash deposits totaling millions of dollars, while surveillance documented a pattern of lavish spending on homes, automobiles, jewelry, and entertainment that far exceeded any legitimate income that Capone could claim. The evidence has painted a picture of a man who lived like a millionaire while claiming to have no taxable income, a contradiction that even the most skillful defense attorneys would find difficult to explain. But building a tax evasion case against Capone also required overcoming the same corruption and intimidation that had protected him from other prosecution attempts. Government witnesses faced threats against themselves and their families, while potential jurors were approached with offers of bribes or warnings about the consequences of voting for conviction. The investigation itself was compromised by informants within federal agencies who provided Capone with advance warning of raids and surveillance operations. Most challenging of all was the problem of establishing Capone's actual income during the relevant tax years. Criminal organizations like Capone's operated largely in cash and maintained few written records that could be subpoenaed by prosecutors. The income that supported Capone's lavish lifestyle was distributed through a complex network of intermediaries and front organizations that made it difficult to trace money directly to its ultimate source. Even when investigators could prove that large amounts of cash had passed through accounts controlled by Capone's associates, establishing his personal responsibility for paying taxes on that income required making legal connections that defense attorneys could challenge. The breakthrough in the tax evasion case came from an unexpected source: the financial records of a single gambling house that Capone had operated during the mid-1920s. A former employee who had been responsible for keeping track of the establishment's profits had maintained detailed records that documented hundreds of thousands of dollars in income that could be directly attributed to Capone's personal control. More importantly, the records covered a specific time period and contained the kind of precise financial information that would be difficult for defense attorneys to dispute or explain away. Armed with this evidence, federal prosecutors felt confident enough to seek an indictment against Capone for income tax evasion, covering the years 1925 through 1929. The indictment charged that Capone had received over $1 million in taxable income during this period, while paying no federal income taxes, a violation that carried potential penalties of decades in federal prison. For the first time in his criminal career, Al Capone faced prosecution that could not be fixed through bribery or intimidated through violence. Capone's initial response to the federal indictment revealed both his continued confidence in his ability to manipulate the legal system and his fundamental misunderstanding of how federal prosecutions differed from the local cases he had been avoiding for years. His attorneys immediately began plea negotiations with federal prosecutors, offering to accept a guilty plea in exchange for a brief prison sentence that would allow Capone to return to his criminal activities after a short interruption. The plea agreement that Capone's lawyers negotiated seemed to confirm his belief that even federal prosecutions could be managed through the same corruption and influence that had protected him from local authorities. Under the proposed arrangement, Capone would plead guilty to tax evasion charges in exchange for a sentence of 2 to 5 years in federal prison, with the understanding that he would serve his time in a minimum security facility where his wealth and connections could ensure comfortable accommodations. But when the plea agreement was presented to federal judge James Wilkerson for approval, Capone received his first indication that the federal system might be less susceptible to his influence than local courts had been. Judge Wilkerson rejected the plea agreement and announced that if Capone wanted to plead guilty, he would have to accept whatever sentence the court deemed appropriate, rather than the lenient terms his lawyers had negotiated. Faced with the prospect of receiving a much harsher sentence than he had expected, Capone withdrew his guilty plea and decided to fight the charges at trial. The decision to go to trial proved to be one of the worst mistakes of Capone's criminal career. During the months of plea negotiations, federal investigators had continued building their case and had discovered additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's position substantially. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case had made it politically impossible for any judge or prosecutor to appear lenient toward a defendant who had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with American law enforcement. The trial of Al Capone began on October 6, 1931, in the federal courthouse in Chicago, before a packed courtroom that included reporters from newspapers throughout the nation. The proceeding was unlike anything Capone had experienced in his previous encounters with the legal system, where friendly judges and corrupted prosecutors had ensured favorable treatment for defendants who could afford appropriate compensation. Federal prosecutors approached the case with a level of preparation and determination that reflected the national attention focused on the outcome. The prosecution's strategy was methodical and devastating in its simplicity. Rather than trying to prove specific bootlegging activities that might be difficult to document, prosecutors focused on demonstrating the obvious contradiction between Capone's lavish lifestyle and his claimed lack of taxable income. Witnesses testified about his expensive homes, automobiles, jewelry, and entertainment expenses, while financial experts calculated that maintaining such a lifestyle required hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual income. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Leslie Lou Shumway, a former employee who had maintained detailed records of the gambling operation that formed the core of the prosecution's case. Shumway's records documented specific amounts of money that had been paid to Capone personally, providing the direct evidence of income that prosecutors needed to prove their tax evasion charges. Under cross-examination, Shumway proved to be an unshakable witness whose testimony could not be discredited by defense attorneys. Capone's defense strategy was hampered by the same factors that had always made him vulnerable to tax evasion charges. His lawyers could not claim that their client was innocent of receiving large amounts of money, since his lifestyle clearly demonstrated substantial income from some source. They could not argue that his income came from legitimate business activities, since Capone had no documented legal sources of revenue sufficient to support his spending patterns. Most problematically, they could not present alternative explanations for his wealth without revealing information about his criminal activities that would expose him to additional prosecutions. The defense team's best argument was that Capone's income came from gambling winnings rather than business profits, since gambling winnings were not clearly subject to federal income tax under the laws in effect during the 1920s. But this argument required proving that Capone was an extraordinarily successful gambler rather than a criminal entrepreneur, a claim that was difficult to substantiate given the systematic nature of his wealth accumulation and the sophisticated business organization that investigators had documented. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Capone's legendary immunity from prosecution was finally coming to an end. The federal system had proven less susceptible to corruption than local courts, while the national attention focused on the case made it politically impossible for officials to appear lenient toward a defendant who represented organized crime's challenge to governmental authority. Most importantly, the tax evasion charges had eliminated Capone's ability to use violence and intimidation to protect himself, since threatening federal officials would only result in additional charges that would make his situation worse. On October 17th, 1931, after deliberating for only 8 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 5 counts of income tax evasion. Judge Wilkerson sentenced Al Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. The man who had been untouchable for over a decade was finally going to prison, brought down not by his criminal activities, but by his failure to pay taxes on the profits from those activities. The conviction of Al Capone marked the end of an era in American organized crime. For the first time, federal prosecutors had demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal leaders could be held accountable for their activities when the government was willing to commit adequate resources and resist corruption. The case also established tax evasion as a powerful tool for prosecuting criminals whose primary illegal activities were difficult to prove in court, a precedent that would be used against organized crime figures for decades to come. But Capone's conviction also revealed the limitations of law enforcement approaches that focused on individual criminals rather than the systemic factors that created opportunities for organized crime. The prohibition laws that had made Capone wealthy remained in effect, ensuring that other criminals would step forward to meet the continuing public demand for alcoholic beverages. The political corruption that had protected Capone's organization remained largely intact, available to serve whoever could afford to purchase official protection. Most significantly, Capone's criminal empire survived his imprisonment largely intact, continuing to generate enormous profits under the leadership of associates who had learnt their trade in his organization. The conviction of public enemy number one was a symbolic victory for law enforcement, but it did little to reduce the actual level of organized criminal activity in Chicago or throughout the nation. The boat that carried Al Capone crossed San Francisco Bay on August 11th, 1934, was transporting more than just another federal prisoner. It was delivering the most famous criminal in America to Alcatraz, the escape-proof prison that had been specially designed to hold inmates whom the government considered too dangerous or too well connected for conventional federal penitentiaries. As the former crime boss looked back at the receding shoreline, he was leaving behind not only his freedom, but the empire that had made him the most powerful criminal in American history. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary had been established on the notorious rock specifically to house inmates like Al Capone, high-profile criminals whose wealth, connections, and notoriety made them security risks in normal prison facilities. The island prison was surrounded by the frigid, shark-infested waters of San Francisco Bay, while its internal security measures were designed to prevent both escape attempts and the kind of special treatment that wealthy inmates might purchase in less secure institutions. For Al Capone, the transition from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary to Alcatraz represented a dramatic reduction in the privileges and accommodations that his money and reputation had initially secured. At Atlanta, Capone had been able to furnish his cell with a desk, bookshelf, and typewriter, while maintaining contact with his organization through carefully managed visits and correspondence. He had been treated as a celebrity inmate whose presence enhanced the prison's reputation, rather than as a dangerous criminal who required maximum security containment. But Alcatraz was specifically designed to eliminate the special treatment that had made Capone's early imprisonment relatively comfortable. The prison's rules prohibited personal furnishings, limited visitors to immediate family members, and censored all correspondence to prevent communication with criminal associates. Most importantly, the isolation of the island location made it impossible for Capone to maintain the kind of direct contact with his organization that had allowed him to continue managing criminal activities from his Atlanta cell. The daily routine at Alcatraz was deliberately monotonous and degrading, designed to break the spirits of inmates who had been accustomed to wielding enormous power in the outside world. Prisoners were awakened at 6:30 a.m. for head count, followed by breakfast in the main dining hall where talking was prohibited. Work assignments included laundry, kitchen duty, and maintenance tasks that were intended to occupy inmates' time, while providing no opportunities for criminal networking or planning. For a man who had commanded an organization of thousands and made decisions involving millions of dollars, the mindless routine of prison life was psychologically devastating. Capone had defined himself through his ability to control events and people, to solve problems through money and violence, and to live according to his own desires rather than external rules. The complete powerlessness of his position at Alcatraz represented not just punishment, but a fundamental assault on his identity and self-concept. The physical conditions at Alcatraz were equally challenging for an inmate who had grown accustomed to luxury and comfort. Cells were small, cold, and furnished only with a cot, sink, and toilet. The food was adequate but monotonous, served in portions calculated to meet nutritional requirements without providing pleasure or variety. Recreation was limited to brief periods in the exercise yard, where inmates could walk in circles under the watchful eyes of armed guards while contemplating the city lights visible across the dark water. But the most difficult aspect of Alcatraz for Al Capone was the complete loss of the respect and deference that had defined his interactions with other people for over a decade. In the outside world, Capone's wealth and reputation had ensured that he was treated as an important person, whose wishes were carefully considered and whose displeasure was to be avoided. At Alcatraz, he was simply prisoner number 85, subject to the same rules and restrictions as every other inmate, with no special status or consideration for his former position. The psychological impact of this transition was evident in Capone's behavior during his early months at Alcatraz. Fellow inmates reported that he seemed confused and disoriented, unable to accept that his previous methods of solving problems were no longer available to him. He attempted to bribe guards and officials with promises of future payment, apparently not understanding that his ability to deliver on such promises had been eliminated by his imprisonment and the government's seizure of his assets. More troubling were the signs of mental deterioration that began appearing during Capone's second year at Alcatraz. Prison medical records from this period document increasing episodes of confusion, memory loss, and erratic behavior that suggested serious neurological problems. Capone would sometimes fail to recognize familiar guards or inmates, while at other times he would become convinced that he was still running his Chicago organization and issue orders to imaginary subordinates. The medical examination that followed these incidents revealed that Al Capone was suffering from neurosyphilis, a late-stage complication of the sexually transmitted disease that he had apparently contracted during his youth in New York. The infection had remained largely dormant during his years of criminal success, but the stress of imprisonment and the passage of time had allowed it to attack his central nervous system with devastating effects on his cognitive abilities and personality. Neurosyphilis was a common but poorly understood condition during the 1930s, when effective antibiotics had not yet been developed, and medical knowledge of the disease's progression was limited. The infection caused progressive damage to the brain and nervous system that could not be reversed or effectively treated, leading to dementia, paralysis, and eventual death. For a man whose greatest assets had been his intelligence and charisma, the disease represented the cruelest possible fate. The deterioration of Al Capone's mental condition during his imprisonment at Alcatraz marked the final stage of his transformation from the most powerful criminal in America to a pathetic figure whose former associates preferred to forget his existence. Reports from prison guards and fellow inmates described a man who spent increasing amounts of time in his cell, talking to himself or sitting silently while staring at the walls. The sharp intelligence and quick wit that had built a criminal empire were being slowly destroyed by a disease that his enemies could never have inflicted deliberately. News of Capone's declining condition gradually leaked to the outside world, where it generated reactions ranging from satisfaction to pity among those who had followed his career. Law enforcement officials expressed gratification that the man who had terrorized Chicago was finally receiving appropriate punishment, while some members of the public found it difficult to reconcile the pathetic prisoner with the powerful criminal who had once dominated newspaper headlines throughout the nation. The criminal organization that Capone had built proved more durable than its founder, continuing to operate under new leadership while adapting to the changing conditions created by the end of Prohibition and increased law enforcement pressure. Frank Nitti, who had served as Capone's chief lieutenant, assumed control of the organization and successfully transformed it from a bootlegging enterprise into a more diversified criminal business focused on gambling, labor racketeering, and loan sharking activities that generated substantial profits with less public visibility than alcohol smuggling had provided. But while the organization survived, its character was fundamentally different from the highly personalized empire that Capone had created during the 1920s. The new leadership was more cautious and less flamboyant, operating with a lower profile that reflected lessons learned from Capone's downfall. The days when Chicago crime bosses could live openly and luxuriously while courting media attention were over, replaced by a more secretive approach that emphasized survival over celebrity. The end of a prohibition in 1933 eliminated the enormous profits that had funded Capone's rise to power, while reducing public tolerance for the corruption and violence that had characterized organized crime during the 1920s. The new criminal enterprises that emerged were generally smaller in scope and less integrated with legitimate business and political institutions, reflecting both reduced opportunities and increased law enforcement capabilities that made large-scale criminal operations more risky and less profitable. For Al Capone personally, these broader changes in the criminal landscape were irrelevant, since his deteriorating mental condition made it impossible for him to understand or participate in contemporary developments. Prison medical records from his final years at Alcatraz describe a man who had retreated almost entirely into a private world of confusion and delusion, emerging only occasionally into lucid moments that seemed to surprise both himself and those around him. The irony of Capone's situation was not lost on observers who had followed his career from its beginning. The man who had achieved success by understanding and exploiting human weaknesses was now completely dependent on the mercy of the same government officials he had once corrupted and intimidated. The criminal who had lived according to his own rules was now subject to the absolute authority of prison guards and medical personnel who controlled every aspect of his daily existence. In 1938, as his sentence neared its end, prison officials faced the question of whether Al Capone was competent to be released into society. Medical evaluations indicated that his neurosyphilis had progressed to the point where he posed no threat to public safety, since he was barely capable of caring for himself, let alone organizing criminal activities. But the same disease that had eliminated his dangerousness had also made him incapable of independent living, requiring constant supervision and medical care that he could only receive outside of prison. The decision to release Al Capone early, in November 1939, was based on humanitarian rather than legal considerations. The former crime boss was transferred directly from Alcatraz to a federal medical facility where he could receive treatment for his condition while serving the remainder of his sentence. For all practical purposes, however, his criminal career had ended years earlier, when the disease began destroying the mental capabilities that had made him dangerous. The man who left prison in 1939 bore little resemblance to the Al Capone who had dominated Chicago's criminal underworld during the 1920s. The sharp intelligence and commanding presence had been replaced by confusion and dependency, while the expensive clothes and confident bearing had given way to the shuffling gait and vacant expression of advanced dementia. The transformation was so complete that few people who encountered him during his final years would have recognized him as the same person who had once been public enemy number one. The mansion that had once been the symbol of Al Capone's criminal success now felt more like a prison than a palace. Set on 37 acres of manicured grounds in Palm Island, Florida, the Mediterranean-style estate had been designed to showcase the wealth and power of America's most notorious gangster. But as Capone shuffled through its empty corridors in 1940, the house seemed to mock its owner's fallen state. Its opulent rooms echoing with memories of parties and planning sessions that would never happen again. May Capone watched her husband's deterioration with a mixture of grief and relief that the man she had married was finally beyond the reach of the violence that had defined his career. The woman who had stood by Al through his rise to power and his subsequent imprisonment, now found herself caring for a stranger whose mind had been destroyed by the same disease that had lurked undetected during his years of criminal triumph. The sharp-witted, charismatic man who had built an empire was gone, replaced by a confused and increasingly helpless invalid who required constant supervision and medical care. The medical team that attended Capone during his final years faced the challenge of treating a condition that was poorly understood and essentially incurable, given the medical knowledge available in the 1940s. Neurosyphilis had damaged his brain extensively, creating a progressive dementia that could not be reversed or effectively slowed. The treatments available, fever therapy, heavy metals, and experimental drugs, were largely ineffective and often caused additional suffering without providing meaningful improvement in his condition. More troubling for his family and physicians was the unpredictable nature of Capone's mental state. He would experience periods of apparent lucidity when he seemed to understand his situation and could carry on limited conversations, followed by episodes of complete confusion when he would fail to recognize familiar people or believe himself to be back in Chicago managing his criminal organization. These fluctuations made it difficult to assess his actual cognitive abilities and impossible to predict his behavior from day to day. The isolation of Capone's final years was perhaps the cruelest irony of a life that had been defined by power over other people. The man who had commanded thousands of subordinates and been courted by politicians and businessmen throughout Chicago now had difficulty maintaining relationships with his own family members. His son Sonny, who had grown up in the shadow of his father's notoriety, struggled to connect with a parent who sometimes failed to recognize him and often seemed to be living in a completely different reality. The few visitors who were permitted to see Capone during this period reported that he spent most of his time sitting by the swimming pool or wandering through his estate's grounds, apparently unaware of his surroundings or his circumstances. The man who had once thrived on activity and excitement now seemed content to exist in a passive state, occasionally emerging from his mental fog to issue orders to subordinates who existed only in his damaged memory. The transformation was particularly striking for those who had known Capone during his years of power and influence. Federal agents who had spent years trying to build cases against him found it difficult to believe that the confused, shuffling figure they occasionally observed was the same person who had once terrorized Chicago's criminal underworld. The intelligence and cunning that had made him so dangerous had been completely erased by a disease that no amount of money or influence could cure. But while Al Capone was fading into irrelevance, the criminal empire he had built continued to evolve and adapt to changing conditions in American organized crime. Under the leadership of Frank Nitti and later Tony Accardo, the Chicago outfit transformed itself from a bootlegging operation into a more sophisticated criminal enterprise that controlled gambling, labor unions, and legitimate businesses throughout the Midwest. The organization survived its founder's imprisonment and mental collapse, demonstrating the institutional strength that Capone had built during his years of leadership. The new Chicago outfit was more secretive and less flamboyant than Capone's organization had been, reflecting lessons learned from his downfall and the increased law enforcement pressure that followed his conviction. The days when crime bosses could live openly and courteously while cultivating media relationships were over, replaced by a more cautious approach that emphasized avoiding attention rather than seeking it. The leadership understood that Capone's greatest mistake had been becoming too visible and too notorious for the political system to ignore. The end of Prohibition had also fundamentally altered the landscape of American organized crime, eliminating the enormous profits that had funded the expansion of criminal organizations during the 1920s, while reducing public tolerance for the corruption and violence that had characterized that era. The new criminal enterprises were generally smaller in scope and more carefully integrated with legitimate business activities, reflecting both reduced opportunities and increased risks associated with large-scale illegal operations. For the Capone family, these broader changes in organised crime were largely irrelevant, since Al's condition made it impossible for him to understand or participate in contemporary developments. May Capone had effectively become a widow while her husband was still alive, responsible for managing the family's finances and caring for an invalid who bore little resemblance to the man she had married. The stress of this situation was compounded by the constant media attention that continued to surround the Capone name, making it difficult for the family to find privacy or normalcy. The final years of Al Capone's life were marked by steady physical and mental deterioration as the neurosyphilis continued to destroy his brain and nervous system. Medical records from this period document increasing episodes of confusion, agitation, and complete disconnection from reality, along with physical symptoms that included difficulty walking, speaking, and controlling basic bodily functions. The man who had once commanded respect through his physical presence and force of personality was reduced to a helpless invalid who required assistance with the most basic activities of daily living. The end came gradually, rather than dramatically, as Capone's overall health declined, while his mental condition continued to deteriorate. On January 21st, 1947, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and largely unable to communicate. He lingered for several days while his family maintained a vigil at his bedside, hoping for some sign that he understood their presence or could acknowledge their love and support. Al Capone died on January 25th, 1947, at the age of 48, in the same Palm Island mansion where he had spent his final years in confused isolation. The cause of death was officially listed as cardiac arrest, but the underlying cause was the neurosyphilis that had been slowly destroying his brain for years. The man who had once been the most feared criminal in America died quietly and peacefully, surrounded by family members who had watched helplessly as disease accomplished what law enforcement and rival gangs had never been able to achieve. The funeral arrangements reflected the complex legacy that Al Capone left behind. The family had originally planned a simple burial in Chicago, but the continued notoriety of the Capone name made this impossible when cemetery officials refused to permit his interment due to concerns about attracting unwanted attention. Eventually, he was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, in a modest grave that bore only his name and dates of birth and death, with no indication of his former position in American organized crime. The public reaction to Capone's death was surprisingly muted, reflecting the passage of time and the changed circumstances that had made his criminal activities seem like ancient history. Newspaper obituaries portrayed him as a relic of a bygone era when organized crime had been more violent and more visible than the sophisticated criminal enterprises that had replaced the bootlegging gangs of the 1920s. Younger Americans who had grown up after Prohibition had ended, knew Capone primarily as a historical figure, rather than an active threat to public safety. But for those who had lived through his era of dominance, Al Capone's death marked the end of a chapter in American history that had fundamentally altered the relationship between crime and legitimate society. His success in building a criminal empire that operated openly and influenced government at every level had demonstrated both the opportunities and the dangers inherent in a system where money could purchase protection from legal consequences. His eventual downfall had proved that even the most powerful criminals were ultimately vulnerable to determined prosecution, but only when the government was willing to commit adequate resources and resist corruption. The legacy of Al Capone extends far beyond his individual criminal activities to encompass broader questions about the relationship between law and morality in American society. His rise to power was made possible by Prohibition, a policy that criminalized behavior that millions of Americans considered acceptable while creating enormous profits for those willing to serve the resulting black market. His ability to operate with impunity for over a decade reflected systematic corruption in law enforcement and government, that went far beyond individual bad actors to encompass institutional failures that made effective crime control impossible. Most significantly, Capone's career illustrated the complex relationship between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise in American capitalism. His organization provided employment, entertainment, and services that met real consumer demands, while generating profits that were reinvested in legitimate businesses and political campaigns. The line between legal and illegal activity was often blurred, with respectable businessmen and politicians maintaining profitable relationships with criminal organizations while publicly condemning organized crime. The story of Al Capone's rise and fall serves as a reminder that criminal success is ultimately temporary, and that the personal costs of a criminal career often exceed whatever material benefits it may provide. The man who achieved wealth and power beyond his wildest dreams spent his final years as a helpless invalid, his mind destroyed by disease, and his empire run by others who had learned from his mistakes. His life demonstrates that no amount of money or influence can protect against the fundamental vulnerabilities that make all human beings ultimately dependent on forces beyond their control. As you drift into peaceful sleep tonight, remember that the greatest empires built on violence and corruption inevitably crumble, while the human costs of criminal success are often paid by those we love most. Al Capone's story reminds us that true power comes not from the ability to intimidate or corrupt others, but from the capacity to build relationships based on trust, respect, and genuine care for other people's welfare. Let the gentle sounds of a distant jazz band carry you into dreams, where success is measured not by wealth or fear, but by the positive impact we have on the lives of others, where power serves justice rather than self-interest, and where the American dream is achieved through honest work and genuine contribution to society, rather than through the exploitation of human weakness and social dysfunction. Sweet dreams await those who understand that the most lasting legacies are built not through crime and corruption, but through service, compassion, and the recognition that our greatest achievements come when we lift others up rather than tear them down.